the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Apart from Hamas, there were these little groups which Israel called rogue terrorist organizations. And Israel went on to say that Hamas enforced the ceasefire on the rogue terrorist organizations with a great deal, although not complete success. So Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire and did its best to enforce it on all other parties. On the other side, Israel reneged on its obligation to lift the blockade of Gaza, that flagrant violation of international law, which was destroying a civilization. Well, what happened next? The record is quite clear. All you have to do is turn to Amnesty International's yearbook for 2008, and they tell you this. A ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza held for 4.5 months. But it broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on November 4th. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Israel reneged on its obligation to lift the blockade, and then Israel waited until November 4th, the American election day, when they knew that the attention of the media and the public would be riveted to the results of the historic election. And on that day, they launched a commando raid into Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants, knowing full well that that would cause a breakdown in the ceasefire. Well, the ceasefire did break down, but Hamas kept saying, we're willing to renew the ceasefire. We're willing to renew the ceasefire if Israel implements its obligation to lift the blockade of Gaza. Israel said no. It demanded an unconditional and unilateral Hamas cessation of rocket fire. In December 2008, Sarah Roy, the Harvard political economist, the world's leading authority in the Gaza economy, and also on a personal side, the daughter of survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp, Sarah Roy wrote in December 2008, the breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us in Gaza. But there is little international response beyond UN warnings, which are ignored. And now the leadership in Gaza had only 2 options. 1, to starve, or 2, to fight. Hamas opted for resistance, albeit largely symbolic resistance. The former Israeli commander in Gaza, he said at this time, at the end of December, this is the former Israeli commander speaking, Gaza commander. He said, you cannot just land blows, leave the Palestinians in Gaza in the economic distress they're in, and expect that Hamas will sit around and do nothing. In the course of the Israeli invasion, the leader of Hamas, Khalid Mishal, he wrote, our modest homemade rockets are our cry of protest to the world. What were those rockets, if not a cry of protest? Saying to the world, a world which just stood passively by as a civilization was being destroyed. The rockets were saying, SOS, we're dying. SOS, we're dying. It's easy enough to condemn Hamas for the rocket attacks, but it does seem to me if you condemn them, you then have to say or show what other option they had. If you want to criticize Hamas, but not show another option, you're in effect saying that the people of Gaza had a legal and moral obligation to lie still and die. In any event, on December 27th, Israel escalated its assault in Gaza and invaded. Well, as most of you know, it was a pretty ugly scene what happened in Gaza during those 22 days. And Israel tried to justify the death and destruction by saying, well, after all, we were engaged in a war, what they called an asymmetrical war against these cowardly Hamas terrorists. And the course of wars, as we know, innocents get killed. In the midst of the battlefield confusion, what's called the fog of war, it's inevitable, or so Israel and its supporters claim, that innocents will die and there will be massive, or at least significant, destruction which was unintended. The entire premise of this argument rests on one point, that there was a war in Gaza. Now, most of the media say there was a war in Gaza. In fact, I just picked up the latest report from Human Rights Watch, which is a decent organization, imperfect, but decent. And the title of their latest report refers to this war in Gaza. Obviously, if there were not a war in Gaza, then the defense that the death and destruction which unfolded was on account of a war or war conditions would not be very tenable. So what happened in Gaza? After those 22 days, the Israelis were very proud of themselves. They went around boasting, now we have shown the Arabs who's who and what's what, because they suffered a significant defeat in July, August 2006 in Lebanon, and they were worried after that defeat that their deterrence capacity had been diminished. Deterrence capacity is one of these fancy technical terms, which just means the Arab world's fear of Israel. And the Israelis were very worried after that July-August defeat in Lebanon that the Arab world no longer feared them. And they said after what happened in Gaza, well, we won the war in Gaza. We have now shown the Arab world that we're a fighting force still, and that they ought to fear us. And then along came an Israeli analyst, a strategic analyst, and he said, and I'm quoting him now, "It is very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war.